There is something specific going on for a lot of people right now that almost no one has a name for. It is not depression. It is not generalized anxiety. It is not just being stressed about the news. It is something more precise than any of those. Something that only shows up in certain moments, around certain topics, in certain kinds of silences. And if you've been carrying it, you probably already know which moments those are. This video is going to name 7 signs of what that experience actually looks like from the inside. Not as a clinical checklist, as a description, because there's a difference between being diagnosed and being seen. By the end, you'll know whether what you've been carrying has a name, and you'll understand why not having that name made it harder to carry. Here's the thing about an experience that has no name. It stays private, it stays unverifiable, it stays in the category of maybe I'm just being dramatic. Because you cannot point to it, cannot hand it to another person, cannot search for it and find out that other people are having it too. The name does something the experience alone cannot do. It makes the invisible legible. Eco-anxiety is a documented psychological response. It has been studied by the American Psychological Association, named by climate researchers, and described in peer-reviewed literature as far back as 2011. It is not a disorder. That distinction matters, so hold it. It is not a sign that something is wrong with your nervous system. It is a specific form of distress that emerges in people who are paying attention to real information about real changes happening in the world they live in. Which means the first thing worth saying, before any list, before any sign, is this. If what you've been feeling is eco-anxiety, you are not overreacting. You are accurately perceiving. Those are not the same thing. And the culture around this topic has spent a long time making it very hard to tell them apart. So, 7 signs. Not to diagnose you from the outside, but to describe what this looks like from the inside so you can decide whether the description fits. Sign 1. Climate news hits you differently than other news and stays with you longer. Not just, that's bad. Something more physical than that. A tightening. A weight that doesn't fully lift by the next morning. Most people read a headline about a wildfire or a record temperature and feel something for a few minutes. People carrying eco-anxiety find that the feeling doesn't metabolize the same way. It accumulates. It shows up at 2 a.m. when you weren't thinking about it. It threads itself into unrelated moments. It is not proportionate to the individual headline. It is proportionate to the whole picture the headline belongs to. If that's your experience, that's sign 1. Sign 2. You do involuntary future math. Without choosing to, you find yourself running calculations. What will the city look like in 20 years? What will summers feel like for people who are children right now? Whether the place you grew up in will still be recognizable in the lifetime of someone you love. These are not thoughts you decide to have. They arrive. And the people around you, the ones who seem fine, don't appear to be running these calculations at all. Which produces a specific kind of loneliness that is hard to explain without sounding like you're catastrophizing. You're not catastrophizing. You're projecting forward from real data. The calculations are accurate. The problem is that accurate calculations about this particular situation are also genuinely painful to hold. That's sign 2. Sign 3. Ordinary purchases produce a guilt response that is faster and more intense than seems reasonable. Not just vague regret, something specific. A flash of cognitive dissonance at the register. A moment of internal accounting that happens before you've even left the aisle. The plastic packaging. The item that came from far away. The choice that was more convenient than you wanted it to be. And then, this is the part that matters. You make the purchase anyway, because the structural reality of most grocery stores doesn't leave a frictionless alternative. And you carry that too. Not just the guilt about the choice, the guilt about not having found a way to not make the choice. The guilt about the whole system the choice is embedded in. That layered guilt response, faster than thinking, more persistent than the moment, is sign 3. Sign 4. Climate conversations cost you something. The climate conversations don't seem to cost other people. There's a specific exhaustion that comes from being in a room where everyone else appears to have silently agreed that this topic is either too heavy, too political, too unsolvable, or simply someone else's problem. And you haven't agreed. You can't agree. You keep not agreeing, quietly, in real time, while the conversation moves on to something easier. That cost, the energy it takes to either raise the topic and watch the room shift, or to stay quiet and feel the distance that silence creates, is real. It produces a specific kind of social tiredness that is hard to trace back to the thing that caused it because it happened in a conversation that technically wasn't about this at all. That's sign 4. Sign 5. You experience grief, not anxiety. Grief about specific places, species, or things that are already gone or already changing. There is a word for this: solastalgia. It was coined by philosopher Glenn Albrecht in 2003 to describe the distress caused by environmental change in a place that is your home. The sense of loss that comes not from leaving somewhere, but from somewhere changing around you while you stay. It feels different from ordinary sadness. It is grief with no funeral. Loss with no recognized mourning period. Something that is genuinely over. A glacier, a reef system, a species, a version of a landscape you knew, that the culture around you has not agreed to stop and mourn. If you have ever felt that specific grief for a place, for a living thing, for a future that was foreclosed, and felt strange about feeling it because there was no socially legitimized container for it, that's sign 5. And that cost gets named here. Sign 6. You feel a persistent, unresolved guilt about the gap between what you believe and how you are actually living. Not because you're not trying, because the trying has a ceiling, and the ceiling is structural, not personal, and the guilt doesn't seem to know the difference. You have the reusable bags. You have tried the things. You know which changes matter more than others, and you still find yourself standing in the gap between your values and your actual daily life. Feeling like the gap is evidence of something wrong with you, rather than evidence of how the systems you live inside were designed. That chronic, unresolved, low-grade guilt, the kind that doesn't lift even when you do the right thing, because the right thing never feels like enough, is sign 6. Sign 7, you feel alone in caring about this in a way that is specific and persistent. Not just "I wish more people cared," but a genuine, recurring loneliness that comes from being someone for whom this is not optional. Surrounded by people for whom it appears to be. The person at the table who cannot stop thinking about something everyone else treats as settled or distant or someone else's problem. The one who reads the article, watches the documentary, absorbs the data, and then has nowhere to put it because the people closest to them are not in the same place. That specific loneliness, not dramatic, not acute, just persistent, is sign 7. Now, here is the mechanism. Because naming the signs is useful, but understanding why they've been so hard to name is what actually changes something. Eco-anxiety is hard to identify for a specific reason. The culture does not have a legitimized container for it. There is no recognized language for the grief of watching a species disappear. There is no social script for the guilt of the plastic-wrapped product. There is no support structure that says, yes, this is a real thing that real people carry, and you do not have to minimize it to be taken seriously. So instead, people do what you do when you're carrying something real that has no name. You turn it inward. You call it overreacting. You call yourself dramatic. You wonder if there is something wrong with your emotional regulation, rather than recognizing that your emotional regulation is working exactly as it should and responding to something real. The research on this is clear enough to say, eco-anxiety is a rational response to accurate perception of a real situation. The distress is proportionate. The problem is that proportionate distress about the state of the world has been handed almost no legitimate outlet. That is not a personal failure. That is a cultural gap. If what's been named in this video is something you've been carrying, and you're at the stage of wanting to do something with it beyond just having the word for it, there's a structured workbook in the description built for exactly this moment. Not a cure, not a list of eco tips. A guided, day-by-day process for moving from "I am a hypocrite who feels terrible" to something more honest and more sustainable than that. It was designed for someone at the beginning of this, which, if you've just named your experience for the first time, is exactly where you are. So what does the name actually do? It does several things, and none of them are small. First, it moves the experience out of the "maybe I'm just dramatic" category. When something has a name, a documented name, a researched name, it becomes real in a different way. Not more real in itself, but real in the social sense. Verifiable, communicable, something you can hand to another person. Second, it makes the experience searchable, which sounds trivial until you consider what it means to type something into a search bar and find out, for the first time, that other people have been carrying the same thing. That is not a small moment. That is the first break in the specific isolation eco-anxiety produces. Third, it separates the experience from the self-judgment. This is the part most content skips. When something you feel has no name, the judgment fills the gap. I am anxious about this because I am fragile. I feel guilty about this because I am a hypocrite. I grieve this because I am overwrought. When the experience gets named accurately, specifically, the judgment has less room, not because the feeling goes away, because the feeling now has a more accurate explanation. And you are having a documented, rational response to real information is a different explanation than something is wrong with you. One more thing the name does, and this one is practical. It gives you something to bring to other people, not the vague sense that you care more than they do, not the frustration that lands wrong in conversations that weren't about climate, the word, the framework, the opening. There's actually a name for this eco-anxiety, and I've been sitting with it for a while. That sentence does something in a room that the unnamed version of the same experience cannot. It invites the conversation rather than closing it. This is not a resolution. Naming something is not the same as resolving it. The climate situation that produced the anxiety is still real. The guilt, the grief, the loneliness, still real. But what changes is your relationship to what you're carrying. And that change, from unnamed private weight to named human experience, is not nothing. It is, in fact, the first step toward everything that comes after. If this opens something you want to go further with, there's a resource in the description built for exactly the next step. Not a replacement for what this video started. An extension of it. Which of these 7 signs landed hardest for you? And have you ever tried to explain that experience to someone who didn't quite get it? So, here is where this actually lands. You came to this video, or it found you, carrying something you may not have had a name for. A specific response to climate news that stays too long. Involuntary calculations about futures you didn't choose to imagine. A flash of guilt at the register. The exhaustion of caring in rooms where that caring isn't shared. Grief for things already lost that no one officially mourned. A gap between your values and your daily life that guilt fills but doesn't explain. A loneliness that is quiet and persistent and real. Those are not 7 random symptoms. They are 7 faces of the same experience. An experience that has a name, that is documented, that is not evidence of fragility or excess or drama. It is evidence of paying attention. And here is what the name does and does not mean. It does not mean you are sick. It does not mean you need to fix your emotional response to the world. It does not mean the answer is to care less, feel less, or look away. What it means is this: you are a person living in a specific historical moment that carries genuinely difficult information about the state of the planet, about its future, about your place in both, and your nervous system is responding to that information with proportionate distress. Not as reassurance, as a more accurate description. The distress is not a malfunction. The guilt is not a verdict on your character. The grief is not overreach. The loneliness is not evidence that you've gotten something wrong. They are evidence that you are someone for whom the state of the world is not an abstraction. That is a specific kind of person. It costs something to be that person. And that cost gets named here. You are not broken. You are responsive. And those two things, real distress and an intact, functioning moral sense, can live in the same person at the same time. They already do. That's what brought you here.